Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're looking at a phenomenon that pretty much all of us have wondered about since we were kids, just, poking around in the backyard. It's that universally relatable childhood mystery. If a spider's web is basically this perfectly designed, super sticky fly trap, why doesn't the spider get stuck in its own web? I mean, it seems like a simple, fun question about bug biology, right? But the answer actually unlocks one of the most incredible stories of evolutionary world domination on the planet. So let's start right at the heart of our central question. How exactly do spiders avoid their own traps? To figure this out, we really have to zoom in, and I mean way, way in. There was this fascinating micro-level investigation conducted by researchers William Eberhard and Daniel Bracino down in Costa Rica. They actually set up modern video cameras right alongside microscopes to record spiders moving on their webs from a ridiculously short distance. This allowed them to finally capture the exact mechanics of this incredible balancing act. And what they discovered is that the spider's immunity to its own glue basically comes down to a few very specific, highly evolved physical traits. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the unique anatomy that makes this whole thing possible. First up, while all spiders have two claws on their feet, web-spinning spiders actually have a third, extra claw, specifically used for grasping the silk threads and giving them traction. It's kind of like a built-in grappling hook. Second, they delicately run on these extremely fine hairs at the very tips of their toes, which massively reduces the actual surface area touching the glue. Third, those tiny hairs are covered in a special chemical coating that completely reduces friction. Under the microscope, the researchers actually saw that when the spider lifts its foot, the adhesive glue droplets slide right down to the ends of the hairs and just drip off. Honestly, it looks a lot like drops of water rolling off a spiky, waxy plant leaf. Combine all that specialized biology with strategic, extremely careful foot movement, and you've got a predator that can sprint across a literal minefield of glue without a second thought. Which brings us to the mechanics of silk, specifically how these creatures turn liquid into solid. To build these webs, the spider physically pulls liquid silk from its own body, which permanently realigns its molecules into a solid thread. And here's the crazy part. They aren't just pulling one generic type of string. Spiders actually spin completely different kinds of silk for different parts of the web. The radial framework and the spokes, those are made of dragline silk. This stuff is incredibly stiff and strong. Scientists literally compare it to steel and Kevlar. It provides that heavy-duty foundation. But the catching spiral, the part actually designed to snag a flying bug, that is made of viscid silk. This silk is much more comparable to rubber. It's highly elastic, it can absorb a massive high-speed impact, and it's dotted with that super sticky glue. What's absolutely wild is that these spiders, which actually have pretty terrible eyesight, use their delicate sense of touch to blindly build these complex, dual-material nets in about an hour. And this incredible biological engineering points to a superpower that is completely unique to spiders. They are the only animals on Earth that use multiple silks for multiple purposes. Get this, a single spider can have up to 7 different silk-producing glands in its abdomen. 7. They don't just use this stuff to build traps, they have customized silks for mating rituals, for weaving protective shields against predators, and for safely encasing their eggs. It's essentially a built-in 3D printing factory. Okay, so we understand the mechanics of the web and the foot. But how does solving the mystery of the spider's foot actually unravel a much larger 400 million-year-old mystery? Well, this is where our story takes a massive pivot. We are zooming out from the everyday anatomy of your friendly neighborhood garden spider and moving right into an epic tale of macroevolution and global dominance. And all of this is driven by a recent, absolutely groundbreaking paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Let's look at the evolutionary divide. Dry Velcro versus wet glue. Check out the stark contrast here between ancient and modern spider technology. Ancient spiders, and actually a few that still exist today, used something called ancestral cribbolate silk. Now, this wasn't wet glue at all. It was this dry, puffed-up thread made of hundreds of tiny brushed fibrils that physically snagged prey using van der Waals forces and hygroscopic interactions. In everyday terms, it acted exactly like dry Velcro. But here's the catch. Physically brushing out those microscopic hairs took a ton of physical work. It was metabolically expensive and painstakingly slow. Modern spiders, on the other hand, evolved to use viscid glue. This is a wet coating applied at the exact same time as the core thread, and it spontaneously forms chemical glue droplets. It functions entirely differently, but most importantly, it is incredibly cheap and lightning fast to produce. And this brilliantly illustrates the real-world impact of that chemical shift. I mean, the advantage is just massive when you look at the time savings here. To physically comb out a dry, Velcro-like cribulate web, an ancestral spider had to work nonstop for about 3 hours. But a modern spider, just laying down that wet, viscid glue, it can spin a highly adhesive web in just 30 minutes. This gave modern spanners a huge evolutionary edge. They saved precious energy, they increased their foraging time, and they spent way less time exposed to predators. The wet glue was so cheap to make that these modern spiders even developed the ability to recycle. Yeah, they actually eat their own webs to recover the proteins and just build a fresh trap the next day. But here is where the researchers found something truly mind-blowing. For the longest time, scientists assumed that because dry Velcro silk and wet glue silk were so fundamentally different from each other, that classic, beautiful, geometric orb web shape must have evolved twice in parallel. But the DNA evidence actually proved them completely wrong. The orb web architecture has a monophyletic origin, which is just a fancy way of saying it evolved only one time in history. It was a singular, brilliant behavioral invention. You see, before the orb, spiders spun these messy, irregular sheet webs that were bound to the shape of the ground or maybe a tree branch. But that stereotyped, highly regular orb shape, that was a technological breakthrough that allowed spiders to suspend their traps perfectly in midair, freeing them from the constraints of the substrate and giving them exclusive access to a massive, previously untouched food source, flying insects. And that leads us to our final chapter, world domination, escaping the web altogether. I want you to consider this rhetorical question for a second. If the midair wet glue orb web was the absolute perfect, most hyper-efficient insect trap ever designed, why on earth did the most successful spiders abandon it? It completely challenges everything we naturally assume about evolutionary perfection. The answer is hidden right here in this massive number, over 21,000. That is the number of individual species in what scientists call the RTI clade. This group includes well-known hunters like wolf spiders, jumping spiders, and crab spiders. Now, these spiders evolved from web-building ancestors, but they completely abandoned the prey capture web. They lost those ancient crimbolum silk-spinning organs entirely and just became free-roaming active hunters. And abandoning the web was clearly a massive evolutionary advantage because it drove absolutely unprecedented species diversification. Today, these webless hunters make up a huge portion of global spider diversity. So the crucial point is this. The classic orb web wasn't actually the final apex of spider design. It was just a brilliant pre-adaptation. Think about the journey here. The aerial orb freed ancient spiders from being stuck on the ground. Then, the invention of wet, viscid glue made hunting metabolically cheap and incredibly fast. But ultimately, breaking the rules of that highly stereotyped web and eventually abandoning webs entirely is what unlocked unprecedented diversity. Today, over 2/3 of all known spider species on Earth dominate their ecosystems specifically because they either completely transformed or entirely walked away from the very web that gave them their start, which leaves us with this powerful quote from the PNS researchers to wrap things up. The orb web is a stepping stone to further behavioral innovation and evolutionary diversification. Nature constantly shows us that even the most brilliantly engineered, perfectly adapted tool is sometimes just a bridge to the next big leap. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What perfect tools, technologies, or systems in our own human world right now are actually just temporary stepping stones to something much, much greater? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and I will see you on the next explainer.